Heading overseas now, US President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro have just held an unprecedented joint press conference to symbolise what they say they hope is the end of 6 decades of hostility. The two had met earlier to discuss a range of issues, including human rights, internet access and the long-standing trade embargo. But the Cuban president became publicly defensive when asked about political prisoners and accused the US of double standards. As Anne Barker reports.
A Cuban military band plays the Star-Spangled Banner to welcome the US president to Havana. Nearly 60 years after the US cut Cuba adrift, Barack Obama and Raul Castro warmly shook hands and stood side by side at Cuba's Revolutionary Palace. On the streets outside, crowds had gathered to catch a glimpse of the first US president in nearly 90 years to set foot on Cuban soil. And Cubans everywhere watched TV coverage of an unprecedented joint presidential press conference.
Our growing engagement with Cuba is guided by one overarching goal: advancing the mutual interests of our two countries, including improving the lives of our people, both Cubans and Americans. That's why I'm here.
Barack Obama promised President Castro the US trade embargo on Cuba would eventually be lifted.
The embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure, but I believe it will end, and the path that we're on will continue beyond my administration.
The Cuban leader said the embargo, now in its 6th decade, was the single biggest obstacle to his country's growth. The blockade is the most important obstacle for our economic development and the well-being of the Cuban people, he said. That's why removing it is essential for us to normalise bilateral relations. But both leaders know that ending 5 decades of hostility can't happen overnight, and the two countries, while almost next door, are still worlds apart on issues like human rights.
We continue, as President Castro indicated, to have some very serious differences, including on democracy and human rights. And President Castro and I have had very frank and candid conversations on these subjects.
President Obama has insisted on meeting a group of dissidents in Cuba which campaigns for the release of political prisoners, members of which were arrested just hours ahead of his visit.
I've met with people who've been subject to arbitrary detention, and that's something that I generally have to speak out on because I hear from them directly and I know what it means for them.
The US president used the joint press conference to push Cuba publicly to improve its human rights record. But President Castro became defensive when asked by a journalist about the issue of political prisoners. What did you say about political prisoners? What concrete question did you ask about political prisoners? If there are political prisoners, did you ask if there are political prisoners? The president asked, "Does Cuba have political prisoners?" said an unidentified reporter in Spanish. "Give me a list right now of political prisoners," the president replied. "What political prisoners? Give me a name or the names. Or when the meeting ends, give me a list of the names. Give me a list of those political prisoners right now, and if the list exists, they'll be released before the night is through." Another question. It's rare for a Cuban president to answer questions like this from the news media. And Cuban journalists watched in awe as visiting US media asked questions of both President Castro and Barack Obama. And under further questioning, President Castro stridently defended his government's record on human rights, accusing the US of double standards. "How many countries in the world comply with all 61 human rights?" he said. "What country complies with all of them? Do you know? I do. None. Some comply with some, others with others. That's where we are. Of those 61 rights, Cuba complies with 47. Some comply with more, many more comply with fewer. You can't politicise the issue of human rights. That's not right." The two countries have already made economic strides since the secret talks 18 months ago that led to this week's visit. Even without Congress lifting the trade embargo, there have been major steps to boost commercial links, restore postal exchanges and begin direct flights between the US and Cuba. And Google has struck a deal to expand Wi-Fi and broadband for Cubans who until now have had very poor access to the internet.
Anne Barker reporting.